Very good morning to all of you. Uh, Tiffany Atkinson is a prize winning poet, critic, and professor of creative writing at the University of East Anglia. Her most recent poetry collection, Lumen, focuses on experiences of medicine and healthcare and draws on her experience as a poet in residence at a local hospital. At present, she's on a Leverhulme Foundation Fellowship, researching and writing a book about poetry, embarrassment, and ethics. Her talk will be a creative critical response to the subject of failure. It was, she tells me, prompted by somebody's slip of the tongue at a party, and is a meditation on the idiomatic language that helps or hinders us in our thinking about cycles of failure and success. 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of listening to Tiffany talk about embarrassment and was completely charmed. I'm looking forward to a similar experience. Please join me in welcoming Tiffany.
Hello. I just noticed the immediate problem. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I'm going to have a glass of water with me, just so I'm not using technology, so wouldn't want to make all the technology fail in the first 5 minutes. Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you indeed for inviting me. Just after Amit invited me to take part in this symposium on failure, I did hear a slip of a tongue which prompted this piece. It gave me the title for this piece, which in the end is not so much a paper as a series of, I suppose, what I'd call creative critical reflections on two failures, one of which is quite personal, quite intimate, I suppose, and one of which is public and national, which have both happened quite recently. So I feel like I'm stepping outside certain professional kind of comfort zones, which I may live to regret. Anyway, so pardon me. Basically, it's sort of 6 sections of thought and then a poem. 1. One door closes, another door shuts. I'm at a party, trying to explain to a friend of a friend, i.e. a complete stranger, why I'll be spending Christmas alone. Somehow I have slipped into this seasonal small talk vortex. But what about your family, he says. Well. In brief, I have one living and eccentric parent who's been married 3 times and woven for us both a complex web of familial estrangements. He doesn't do Christmas. I am his only biological child and have no children of my own, which is to say that my efforts to become a parent, including a late and ill-advised effort at IVF treatment, have been slowly, repeatedly and expensively unsuccessful. Partly as a consequence of this, my partner and I have just separated. Most of my belongings are in storage while I renovate a hastily bought, tiny and much neglected house, floorboard by floorboard, light switch by light switch. There is no working kitchen yet, so inviting friends over is out of the question, and in any case they will be busy with their own families. Of course, I don't say any of this. It's a party in England. I say, "Oh, it's a time of transition." "Ah," says the stranger, amiably raising his glass. "Well, you know what they say, one door closes, another door shuts." I smile. "Wait. No, I mean," he is flustered. "It's okay," I say, "it's okay." And really, it is. His slip of the tongue, his unconscious failure to hold the hopeful door open, has not only revived the tired old cliché of disappointment yielding unforeseen reward, it has furnished me with an unexpected moment of containment, an impasse, a framed failure that is, truthfully, almost restful in its domestic fatalism. For the moment, there is nowhere to go. In my head, an applause of doors claps shut back through the years, on all my and my father's lost, exhausted, or otherwise failed partnerships, until the last one hangs ajar on a distant nativity, 1973, my mother and I, my recently promoted officer father, and our gentle spaniel Remus curled in the ersatz firelight of a Berlin army quarter. From a particular hetero-familial, upwardly mobile, middle-class vantage point, from the narcissistic point of view of nuclear family mythology, this was peak domestic and emotional attainment. It's all downhill now. 40-odd years later, I am, genetically speaking, sentimentally speaking, the end of the line. I have tried and failed to do my bit for genetic and sentimental futurity, but that door has closed. At last I have heard the click. There is a moment of familiar existential panic. Then, for the first time since adolescence, I allow myself to feel not stubbornly effortful, optimistic and resilient, but voluptuously, irresponsibly, singular and doomed, a failure. There it is. I raise my own glass. Cheers. 2. If at first you don't succeed. Why bring this embarrassing personal matter into the context of the public talk, as I am very much wondering right now? Because I want to remind myself that failure, spoken of as something remote, speculative, conceptual, only distantly related to one's most intimate hopes and desires, is not felt as failure, not really, not once it has been helpfully curated into a triumphant or otherwise tolerable narrative of resilience. What I'd like to keep in mind is the affectively sticky, catastrophizing, melodramatic, self-pitying, exceptionalizing thickness of it, the shame, the obsessiveness, the blame, the powerlessness, the regret. Because this is how I get to test what is at stake, what kind of conceptual apparatus is available to think about, to write about failure, and to acknowledge the work involved in moving from its aggrieved self-absorption to a position that enables some kind of fruitful engagement with the world. And I won't dwell on this, but at the moment in the UK anyway, and perhaps coming from the States, there's a kind of a mainstream publishing phenomenon that has come to be called fail-lit, and it's sort of loosely comprised of memoir, self-care, auto-fiction, self-help books, and it has clearly a very popular and marketable kind of trajectory of self-awareness and I suppose triumphalism, triumph over adversity, and I think ever more microscopic self-awareness. And there's a particular podcast and book I was going to talk about by a journalist and writer called Elizabeth Day called How to Fail. It's a very popular podcast. But I don't really have time, but perhaps we can talk about that if that's something that resonates with people's experience of mainstream publishing. Anyway. So why else bring the embarrassing personal matter into the talk? Also because I think at least the slip of the tongue is a caution about cliché, the cognitive trap into which we are apt to fall when using absolute terms like failure. In the dialectic of idiom, the opposite of failure must be success, no matter how circuitous. One door slams shut, another creaks gradually open, and indeed we are obliged to keep banging on it until it does, since failure's condition must first be the effort put into trying. If you didn't want it badly enough in the first place, you haven't failed so much as just stayed where you deserved, and even if you failed, you haven't really failed, you just haven't quite succeeded yet. You may yet get to cash in your story of failure for a story of triumph. This investment is what keeps you in the game. It's a kind of affective Ponzi scheme. This is one of the sustaining promises of meritocracy, and I can't help observing that IVF has much in common with neoliberal exceptionalism. A layer of hubristic manifest destiny, as a woman I deserve to be a mother, held in place by murky empirical evidence and a hot core of emotional investment and magical thinking. Just relax, said the nurse across another barrage of invasive procedures. That's the magic ingredient. But statistically, IVF doesn't usually work, not if you're my age anyway. Statistically, one is not likely to be the happy exception, though one buys both literally and figuratively into the idea that the more rounds you try, the more you are owed success. It didn't work for me, but in this respect, I am nothing special. Its failure is sad, but not properly speaking a catastrophe or a crisis, which would be a failure that is utterly exceptional, unforeseen. And between the door that closes and the door that shuts, there is time and space, an anteroom of sorts, a poetic interlude, an impasse, where forward momentum, the narrative of one's life meaning, is momentarily suspended. In this space, perhaps the feelings of failure may at least be detached from the pragmatics, and I am wondering what can happen there. 3. Be a good loser. To be fair, the Christmas party vibe was already heavily compromised by the UK general election on 12th of December 2019, which, to the horror and despair of many, delivered the biggest Conservative majority since Thatcher's 1987 landslide. But then it's not a good time to be to the left of anything, unless maybe you're in the Bullingdon Club and the port's coming round, which would be approximately 0.00009 of the UK population. The mood among the radical and centre-left and all those who voted strategically in the hope of tempering the Tory majority was and continues to be one of despondency and recrimination. Certainly it felt like more than short-term electoral defeat. This result seemed to ring the death knell of left-wing ideology in the UK, exacerbated of course by the implications of Brexit and our now inevitable imminent departure from the EU. If the Labour Party's heavy defeat was the second door to slam shut, the first was surely the Brexit referendum in June 2016, and perhaps also the thud of Trump's November 2016 victory, still reverberating brashly across the Atlantic. One door closes, another door shuts, and then another. The question of electoral failure has become, for the left-leaning electorate, a national crisis, a failure that now feels exceptional and especially damaging, an exhaustion of all possible resources. What does it mean to be a good loser, a gracious failure in the democratic context? I'm not sure the UK can offer the best example. In the aftermath of the 2016 Brexit referendum, the 48% who voted to remain in the EU were quickly dubbed Remoaners by the Leavers, not least for the disbelief and outrage we expressed in marches, vigils and petitions, followed by repeated efforts to undermine the validity of the democratic process itself. A few Remainers in the Tory government at first sought to delay activation of Article 50, the process by which leaving the EU would be negotiated. Activist Gina Miller took government to court in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to have the referendum invalidated on the grounds it was unparliamentary. Multiple public petitions were made for a second referendum in the hope that, given the right information, this might return the right desired result. This approach was almost carried through into the Labour Party's electoral manifesto last year, while the Liberal Democrats' election policy promised to revoke Article 50 altogether and seamlessly, if unfeasibly, reverse Brexit. Though I would have rejoiced myself had any of this proved possible, I have to concede that this behaviour, seen from the perspective of a statistical majority, is the hallmark of the poor loser, a sore combination of complacent privilege, hand-wringing and self-pity. To invoke the public school sporting argot from which the gentlemanly notion of fair play and the good loser surely derives, the Remoaner became the equivalent of the tennis player who smashes their racket or the footballer who curses the referee. No doubt the Brexit referendum was a disastrous embodiment of the adage, ask a silly question. But had the Remainers won a majority of 52%, would we be calling for further referenda? Unlikely. We would surely have declared that to keep polling until you get the desired result makes a mockery of democratic process and is, moreover, a desperately conservative sort of revisionism. And, as the right-wing media consistently reminded us, the people had spoken. We just didn't like what they had said. But that is democracy. 4. Winner takes all. There's an old joke that one cannot be a little bit pregnant, but after the IVF months I beg to differ. Reproductive technologies like IVF work not like the thunderclap of natural conception, but by the slow accumulation of odds of success. For illustration, at our first appointment, my partner and I were given a 3% chance of success, only they don't say that, they say a 3% chance of a live birth. This is before any intervention, any preparation, any labour, and highlights the attenuated speculative process which involves over months intensive screening, hyperstimulation of the ovaries, harvesting of eggs and sperm, insemination of eggs, incubation of embryos, implanting of embryos, and then the possibility of carrying a pregnancy to term. As each of these stages is passed, the odds improve a little, so that by the time our embryos were implanted, we'd boosted our chances of success to a shimmering 12%. Much like the pre-election opinion polls, each new statistic carries a magical aura. Things are heading in the right direction. You are preparing to succeed. No matter that the odds were ridiculous to begin with, we felt at each stage a little more pregnant as, buoyed up by the moral effort of trying, one door squeaks slowly open, then another, a condition which the critic Lauren Berlant, in a different context, has called cruel optimism. Cruel optimism describes the compromised relation that we individuals in a precarious neoliberal present have in relation to the objects of our desire, itself a glib phrase that works to mystify the actual material conditions of these hopes. Such objects arise among clusters of promises that make up eudaimonia, the classical notion of the good and meaningful life, of human flourishing. Optimism per se, as a forward-facing attachment structure, is not in itself problematic. The compromise comes from the fact that the economic, political, social conditions that once facilitated an upwardly mobile good life, as we currently understand it, no longer exist, and the cruelty from our inability to relinquish our attachment to the object, even if we understand it to be impossible or damaging. A relation of cruel optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing, writes Berlant. But in the end, it is less the objects themselves, which on closer inspection usually reveal themselves to be flawed, than the deep fantasies which they lay down in us that prove so hard to relinquish. Why do people stay attached to conventional good life fantasies, writes Berlant, say, of enduring reciprocity in couples, families, political systems, institutions, markets, and at work, when the evidence of their instability, fragility, and dear cost abounds? Because of the power of fantasy. Fantasy, she continues, is the means by which people hoard idealizing theories and tableaux about how they and the world add up to something. And these fantasies, of course, are ideological. As Jack Halberstam puts this in his book The Queer Art of Failure, success in a heteronormative capitalist society equates too easily to specific forms of reproductive maturity combined with wealth accumulation, or, more epigrammatically, success equals succession. Thus, to keep trying despite the known likelihood of failure is to stay bound up in the compelling structuring fantasy. To let go is not just to relinquish the object, let's say the baby, but the bathwater, the tub, and indeed the whole rig of the house, the very apparatus that allows you to function as a person at all. It is not as simple as just finding another object to orientate yourself towards, since it feels pretty much as if there would be nothing left of you to point with. You would need to build the whole apparatus again, claims Berlant, and at the same time dismantle the logic of success, says Halberstam. This perhaps is why failure hardly ever feels like a reasonable if unfortunate outcome, why it feels catastrophic, an exhaustion of resources. This is the situation that I think my partner and I found ourselves in. 5. It's the taking part that counts. What then of the fantasy structure of having been at least a little bit pregnant? Is there any space for meaning, any flourishing in the partly attained object? Conventional success-failure logic would say not, but perhaps this is akin to the garish pie chart diagrams that erupted across my social media the day after the general election, showing how, if in the UK we had proportional representation instead of a first-past-the-post electoral system, sort of analogue rather than digital signal perhaps, the Labour Party could perhaps be seen not to have done as badly as all that. Both of us are also Rand's casualties of cruel optimism. Yes, but at least we were in the race, and we knew the terms of the race, the promise of the good life we had bought into. As it happens, I found those pie charts oddly mobilizing, though not in quite the intended way. They help me to visualize a collaborative structure to trying, rather than a purely agonistic one where at the level of the individual success is felt as a zero-sum game. They represent complex communities of people, not just the metonymic individuals that come out on top. In putting these thoughts together, I realized there might be an analogous pie chart for all of us who met awkwardly in the waiting room at the fertility clinic. The effect, and I'm still trying to think this through, so forgive me the clumsiness, was somehow one of diffusion or a lateral movement out of the self, as if in this collective endeavour some doors would open and some would not. But the emotional cost could somehow be balanced out across the whole room, so that the effort was felt not as taking part in a solitary battle against probability. In short, it was a feeling of internal pressure against the privatization of failure. The structuring fantasy of the good life, represented by the perfect little family, is ideological collective after all, though like all things that appear to be common sense, it hides its workings very well. And IVF, if nothing, is nothing if not intensely privatized, both as a financial and medical legal institution and in the ways that its shame and high personal stakes combine to make it a highly self-involved process for all those who undergo it. Since it is beyond my capacity to revolutionize the culture of IVF waiting rooms right away, I will return to the election by way of Halberstam's work on queer failure to explore what this internal pressure against the privatization of failure might mean in practice. On the morning after the election, alongside the social media pie charts, there was a flurry of postings from helplines and support groups, together with articles from leftist national newspapers, all of which recognised that despair and despondency could have serious consequences for people's mental and physical health and their ability to manage their actual lives, that it might be taken personally. This was not a call to engage in political debate or to keep trying to win that argument, but to turn sideways, as it were, and acknowledge the people next to you. For example, The Guardian ran a piece called Don't Despair, a practical guide to making a difference from food banks to fighting fake news. This was richly advocating grassroots activism, community work and volunteering and so forth. This was ritually supplemented as the day went on by suggestions and links from readers, so it became this kind of collaborative text. The article began, "It's natural to feel hopeless today. A decade of deep cuts have already caused incredible pain, with growing poverty and crumbling services across the country. There are many people who will undoubtedly have woken up today and felt fear about the future. I, the journalist, have spoken to many over the past decade, from disabled people who've lost their benefits to those on low wages choosing between eating and heating. It's heartbreaking to think about what another 5 years, another 5 years of Conservative government will do to those who can't take a further squeeze. But there is always hope, just as there are steps we can take together," and so on, and then come lists of things that people can get involved with. I've never seen anything quite like this in a national newspaper, and I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I do volunteer for a food bank, and by the end of that weekend the number of volunteers had doubled, so it clearly had reached quite a lot of people. Yes, there is an element of do-gooder sentiment to this, but it is also legible as a claiming back of the agency of group relations outside the political mainstream. As Halberstam puts it, traditions of political action that, while not necessarily successful in the sense of becoming dominant, do offer models of contestation, rupture and discontinuity for the political present. In this model, Halberstam argues, failure is the map of political paths not taken, though it does not chart a completely separate land. Failure's byways are all the spaces in between the superhighways of capital. In these byways potentially lies a space for building the motivational apparatus again on different terms, while dismantling, or at least reframing, the logic of success. The door on that neoliberal fantasy, which for the time being happens to be the door to number 10 Downing Street and the door of the White House, to name but two, has shut. So it may be helpful to think of the opposite of failure not as success, but as collaboration. 6. No matter, fail again, try again, fail better. This adage is the one that will be recognised as attributable to a known author, since it's a well-known aphorism of Samuel Beckett, which happens to mirror "one door opens, another door shuts" in its querying of the failure is just unrealized success logic. So I conclude with some speculations on how the space behind the shut door, as it were, might have significance to writing practice, since I'm a creative writer, and I would like to explore the forms through which failure might be refigured as significant without being yoked to some kind of meritocratic model of ultimate success. Also, I'm a poet, so that kind of comes with the territory to an extent. Lauren Berland, in Cruel Optimism, rather cryptically suggests that instead of constructing stories of triumph, one should become a poet of the episode, the elision, the ellipsis, presumably because traditional realist narrative genres are partly how bourgeois fantasy structures have come to pass for real life. The elision and ellipsis potentially forestall the headlong narrative rush through which plots deliver success as revelation or resolution. Certainly, experimental poetic writing already works as a challenge to conventional reading practices, through which one typically works towards mastery of a text, a decisive interpretation, some kind of hermeneutic victory, I suppose. Elements of collaborative writing, collage, or the introduction of randomized composition methods, like those used by John Cage, for example, might further limit the optimistic but, I think, misleading power of active intention, and thus destabilize the notion of trying from the point of view of the poem as a piece of individual expression. So, through this brief survey of structural premises, I felt that the tiny flicker of a poem that might try to hold striving and failure in the same virtual space, but I guess refused to deliver an outcome because the poem doesn't know and doesn't really have any interest in intention or interpretation. So the poem would be some kind of holding pattern or something full of glitches, something that prevents that kind of renewal of failure as a story of success. It would have the durational structure of an impasse, perhaps, or as Berlant calls it, a productive kind of dithering. And it would resist the easy but, to my mind, mendacious consolation that failure makes one a stronger or a better person, even supposing I knew or cared to know what that might mean, or to whom. This poem would be a very small ambition indeed, or rather its ambition would be somehow to sidestep the narrative structures of ambition. But God knows, sometimes you just need to read something that lets you off the hook. So I will finish with the first and only poem I've written around the IVF experience, around, not about. And the poem is a kind of holding pattern for cycles of trying and for the flashes of fantasy that animate them. It has a substantial collage component, and it comes from an old French lullaby, La Poulette Grise, the little grey hen, which has obvious connection with intimacies of maternity and how those are handed from generation to generation. But it also brings in a quite embarrassing register of babble, of nonsense, a glitch, actually, I suppose, which I hope works to undermine the intentional, self-contained quality of voice that often belongs to the lyric poem, but certainly belongs, I think, to the many cruelly optimistic aphorisms we have built around failure. Okay, so I'll finish with this poem. La Poulette Grise, an IVF lullaby. It's the grey chicken who lays in the church, hunkering down where cold dust hems her skirts, little sin eater. She's going to lay a beautiful. It's the white chicken who lays in the branches, lean as a whip of willow in March breezes, little dream catcher. She's going to lay a beautiful little cocoa for. It's the black chicken who lays in the armoire, freshening the rusty silks for feast days, little pearl warmer. She's going to lay a beautiful little cocoa for her little one. It's the yellow chicken who lays in the alders, under dropping leaves in shoals of rain, little nut warbler. She's going to lay a beautiful little cocoa for her little one who's going to do-do-do. It's the green chicken who lays in the glazes, soft crystal tunnels pecked by bees, little seed hatcher. She's going to lay a beautiful little cocoa for her little one who's going to do-do-do, do-dish-do-do. It's the brown chicken who lays in the moon, intuited egg of the tides, oh, sin-eater, dream catcher, pearl warmer, nut warbler, seed hatcher, oh, meteorite in the piazza. She's going to lay a beautiful little cocoa for her little one who's going to do da-da-da-dish-da-da. She's going to lay a beautiful little... Thanks.
That was beautiful, Tiffany. Would you like to come?
Yeah. The water
should I open this for question? I have a question myself. I can't exactly say why. I kept thinking back to a room of one's own. And as you spoke, I noted down some of the metaphors that you had been using, and it turns out that some of them have to do with space and architecture. The title itself, and then at last I've heard the door click, the door creaks, an anteroom, and then the emotional cost could be distributed amongst the whole room. So were you thinking of failure in terms of space and architecture, or as you know, the architecture of failure itself?
No, but you've done that for me really helpfully. That's really helpful. I suppose, to an extent I was, because of the inadvertent metaphor that came up with that person saying one door shuts, another door closes, and then you're in like an anteroom of some sort. And I am interested in those and those sort of liminal spaces. What happens when you can't pass through immediately? What do you do? And I hadn't mapped it out as clearly as you have, but I might. I think there probably is a metaphor in there. I mean, I speak about the IVF thing not because I'm saying poor me. I really don't feel that about it. I did it because I think one may substitute that particular desire for any number in terms, hopefully, of thinking about a structure of how desire and hopes work. For all of us. I mean, I think we're all implicated in that in some way. But I would hope that it might be possible to think it through a bit more fully with your help. So thank you and I might go back to a room of one's own to help develop that architectural metaphor. So thank you very much.
Questions from the audience? Clancy. Is there a mic somewhere? Yeah.
I was just, I was incredibly moved by this brilliant talk of yours. Thank you so much. Really brilliant and also so moving. I've never wept in an academic conference before, but now I have. And so on that theme, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about this connection that I'd never thought about before until this talk, between failure and grief, basically, and contexts in which somehow we are not allowed to grieve because it is bound up with a particular conception of oneself wrestling with the concept of what are the legitimate grounds for grieving, and whether we have failed to satisfy the legitimate grounds for grief. This comes up a lot, I think, in people trying to think about, just to speak on the topic of which we are speaking, the very, very difficult subject of prenatal death.
Gosh, yes, that's a really important question, and one I don't feel qualified to answer entirely. I mean, I am aware that there is a great deal of work being done by sort of medical care professionals, and particularly feminist ones, about that, about what are you allowed to mourn? What's an object? Isn't it something about that? Isn't it? It's like, what is the object? Can it be a wish? Because is it a wish fulfillment? Because certainly in the case of IVF, I mean, you're not really it's not the same as a baby. It's very complicated. However, I think that there's a really interesting definition, isn't there, about Freud makes it between mourning and melancholia, about the work of each. That one is a fairly conscious narrative. I'm simplifying, of course, but a fairly conscious narrative move that you gradually withdraw attachment to a lost object, and you know exactly what that lost object is. I mean, you're kind of smitten by it. I mean, you can't not know it. And that gradually you withdraw affect and sort of re-thread it elsewhere. That's the work of mourning, and we have many cultural institutions that help us do that. Melancholia is a bit murkier, isn't it? Because you don't really know what the object is. I mean, you don't know yourself. So you're slightly sort of hamstrung in the unconscious there, and it's work that's never really done. You can't let go because you never really had it in your hand in the first place. And I'm thinking of Denise Riley, actually, a poet and philosopher who also works at UEA, who's written very, very movingly about this as a mother who has lost an adult child, actually, although I think she would say that's kind of, to some extent, incidental to her work. But about the pressure to mourn, to do that work and to let go and to move on, and what it means. She has a maternal image, I think, of holding on, keeping the grief inside you in a melancholic structure, because that's what mothers do. You know, it's very beautiful, and it's a nice kind of correction, I think, to the idea, which I do align with this. If you fail, you must succeed. You know, that's the narrative we owe people. That's the commercial narrative, that you get over it and you get on, and you do something else. You do something productive. And I suppose ultimately I'm interested in some structures of thought that allow you to stay in that anteroom, you know, to maybe keep that melancholic relation to something, but to find another way of using those drives, those desires. Sorry, that sounds really woolly. So yes, what am I saying? Yeah, I mean, I think that there are very strong therapeutic reasons for why structures of grieving are important, and why maybe people need to be allowed to own those. But I am also interested in those sort of murkier, melancholic structures where you're not dealing with such a clear-cut object. That's an answer.
First of all, again, to say just thank you so much for that. So nice. But also thank you for that comment about grief. And just to add to that, it's interesting that people expect grief to end. So, you know, I mean, you talked about melancholia as replacing, but I think one could go even further than that and say, I certainly don't, my father died 15 years ago. And the immediate reaction was, okay, well, you know, you have to grieve and then that's over. But you know, you don't want it to end, actually.
No, that's what Denise Riley also said. Why? Why would I want to relinquish that connection? Yeah. Yes.
And that
really important.
ties in very much, I think, with the narrative of failure leading to success.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to follow on those two comments with a further thought in this very fine talk you've given, Tiffany, and that is the notion of the failure that can't be repaired. I mean, that's to say, the point at which you've failed, but you know that there is nothing more that can be done, as it were, to undo that failure. I mean, that seemed to me to be another very powerful motif that emerged in what you were saying, and I think may be connected to the notion of a continuous grieving. I'm not sure, but it's something that's part of that structure.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that was the genuine moment of relief I felt when that person made that slip, and he did me a huge favour, because there's this pressure to keep trying. And it's a kind of exhausting compulsion to repeat optimism, and sometimes it's stupid. I mean, it's just stupid, and that's okay, you know. And I think there are times where it is okay to sort of concede failure, but then to explore, not in a kind of, and then I discovered windsurfing or something like that, you know, not in that way, but to be able to hold all these things and yet still function as a person with kind of attachments and ambitions and hope, but not in that very tightly packaged somehow way. So yeah, thanks. That was an important thing about the door closing and the door shutting.
Thank you. Also, from me, for this talk, which opened lots of doors for thinking, at least. I was interested in the concept that you introduced at some point of the privatization of failure, and I wondered to what an extent it might be linked or caused by the privatization of success, and that perhaps the one model that you were suggesting as an alternative was in following up on this Guardian article was solidarity, and that solidarity may be neither success nor failure, but there could be it could be a sort of a third another dimension to this, and how that might relate to this anti-room or the impasse you were speaking about. I wasn't quite sure, because one seemed potentially a withdrawal and the other one seemed an engagement with a social space. So I simply wondered if you could think this further.
I don't know the answer to that, but you're right, there is a contradiction there, and I think that's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, the thing about the room, the movement in the door closed, the ante-room at first felt like a private room, and then of course I realised that in literal terms it wasn't. It was a waiting room full of people with presumably the same desires and hopes and fears. You know, so it's an illusion. That kind of private feeling of it being me and I am exceptional is rubbish. You know, there are many others. Now, there's no way I experienced of that being activated, and that would take some kind of resources that I don't really have. But I think the idea that that is a singular experience in any way is a mistake. So first of all, there was a sort of recognition of that mistake. But what you said about the privatizing of success, which is I think partly what Amit started by talking about in sort of culture of literary celebrity, for example, also could use some unpicking, couldn't it? So if failure is not a private thing necessarily, neither is success. I mean, even at the very basic level of, you know, the individual genius who wins all the prizes is put there, is maintained there by all kinds, a whole infrastructure of people. I mean, it's a basic Marxist model, I suppose. So that kind of that idea that success is not anymore, shouldn't be anymore a kind of privatized endeavor than failure. And in literary criticism, I think we do start to unpick that, don't we? We are starting to dismantle those stories of these isolated geniuses that just sprang out of nowhere. That they were also difficult births, if you like, with many failures along the way. So there are two really important things there that I would like to develop. So thank you.
So one last question.
Just a couple of, because he wants to ask something. So a couple of comments. Thank you. I mean, not yet another amazing talk from you after the one in 2018, right? So I just wanted to ask you, I mean, about failure and laughter. You started off with that instance of mishearing. Oh no, the slip of the tongue. And we all laughed, and we laughed quite a few times in the course of your talk, and then again when you quoted Beckett. However, it wasn't a mocking laugh, so it wasn't as if we were laughing at somebody who had failed. So I was wondering what kind of laughter that was. It was a kind of delight we were taking, but we weren't taking a delight in failure as such. But we were still delighting in the slip of the tongue and everything that followed from it. There was that. So it wasn't a completely somber talk. We would lose a dimension if we didn't see the non-mocking humor, which still had a kind of richness about it, and our laughter, our response to it. So I just thought I'd ask you about that.
Yeah, that I'm glad. Thank you. Yes, I mean I mean, because of the work I do on embarrassment, I'm quite interested in silliness and laughter, and I certainly don't think that there's anything about serious, if we can call this a serious subject. You know, I mean, the kind of po-facedness, if you like, of some criticism is so deeply tedious. You know, it takes the self so seriously, and I suppose I think that one of the ways out of that feeling of really internalized despair is not to take yourself so seriously, and that laughter felt supportive. It felt kind of collaborative in some way. It didn't feel mocking. I mean, I could have coped if it had been mocking. It's okay. I'm not that fragile, but there is a strong quality to that kind of laughter, and there is there is a sort of a sense in which that also is a space for something, for some kind of alternative way of thinking about ourselves in relation to these big structures of meaning, you know, what we mean and what we will mean, and so on. So I'm just glad that that's the effect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany, for another very moving talk. And one of the things that really struck me was this running parallel that ran through your talk between the British elections and a very personal story. And I think the question of the private came up, and Shimona has mentioned Woolf's Room of Her Wound. I kept thinking of Three Guineas, where actually Woolf talks a lot about a very militant, very masculine public sphere, and I think she's almost making a plea for remaking the public sphere in the image of the private, which is obviously has a long tradition of women's, experience. And I think this is a question which never goes away. I mean, what is the normative relationship between the public and the private? And I think this is a question which I think you indirectly push in your talk. I mean, of course, there are no real answers to it, but I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, another great thing for me to go back to. Thank you. I hadn't thought of it like that. I mean, unusually, in my experience, this happened the other way. The kind of revelation, such as it was the other way around. It was something that happened in the public sphere that changed the way I felt privately. So I don't know if you're familiar with these, but the sort of post-election, what's they called, pie charts, you know, and it was there was something about seeing that people were trying to cheer each other up, basically. But that first of all, the move towards, you know, there are things you can do. And that kind of that call to explicit kind of community engagement was something new to me, but also that way of thinking about even something as what feels in some ways as distant as polling results, insofar as we have our individual relationship to them, but the rest of it is a big unknown thing. You know, to see that there were ways of thinking about it where the effort of others was visible. I think that was it. It was that it wasn't just about me and my relationship to this kind of fantasy of governance, but that effort was visible. So that was an unusual experience for me of something that was effectively a kind of an external political thing, changing something internally. But I think that certainly in the UK we're potentially, maybe making virtue of necessity here, but at an interesting point where some of those relationships between what's left over, the kind of the chaos of what's happened, it feels like to all the sort of left-wing people like me and lots of others, how that starts to perhaps change our relationship with our politics and government. I don't know. It's a big one, isn't it? But I'm certainly going to go back to Three Guineas. That's really useful. Thank you.
I see that there are other questions, but I'm afraid we're running short of time. Maybe you could have a discussion.
Okay, thank you. I can do without it. Ma'am, I have made quite a few observations, political observations, so to say. Yeah. Oh, thank you. You have made quite a few political observations. Well, I would like to draw your attention. You said labor failure and proportional representation. I would add to that. The Labour also made a historic political blunder during their campaign, and that was they, through the time of Attlee and right down now, they have been pro-Indians, so to say. But this time, on Kashmir issue, they went just on the back foot. And they paid for it, if you don't mind.
No, not at all. I mean, I was slightly nervous of bringing up politics because my knowledge of politics is lousy. But yeah, I mean, I will certainly concede that there are many mistakes, and the Labour Party is in tatters, and in a way, rightly so. It's time to sort of start again. But yes, I will. Thank you. Take any kind of points of accuracy on, because I don't know that.
Could we really close the session now, because we're running very short of time? Tiffany, that was wonderful. And I'm also interested in how you think of failure in terms of the tradition of embarrassment that you have been working on that I heard you speak about. So thank you again.